America that we celebrate every year just to kind of commemorate the people that served in the office of President of the United States. How many presidents we have? Anyone tell me? How many? 46. We're on our 46th president right now. And the role of the president, of course, the executive branch of our country, is to lead our country. He's the one that, when Congress passes the laws, the executive branch is the one that enforces them. He's the commander-in-chief of the Army. He's the man who really comes to symbolize what America is. And we've been very blessed with the two people that I've come to look at as really friends, as I've studied them and gotten to know them. Two men in particular that times in my life when I've struggled to know what's the right thing to do, where can I turn to. Of course, the greatest person we turn to, of course, is our Savior. When we don't know what to do in life or how to do things. But many people in the world, otherwise, have lived lives in a different way that we can look to as an example of how we should live. And two of those people that I really look at as friends of mine are George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Anyone that's ever been in my class in 5th grade kind of knows my opinion of what George Washington was. Washington was a man that didn't really set out trying to get fame or glory like some people do. He was a man who really felt that duty and honor were the greatest things, the greatest gifts you could have in life. And he always put his country and his fellow man ahead of his own needs and wants. He wanted nothing more than to be a farmer. He really loved Mount Vernon, he loved to farm, he loved that, and that was the best times he had in life was actually being a farmer. But at different times in his nation's history, Washington was called to be at the forefront of that history. And many, many times he was under the protection of God. And I've come to believe that when I was in the military, possibly being sent overseas, I didn't actually get over there, but I was thinking about those possibilities. I thought, all we can do as soldiers in this country is put ourselves in God's hands and hope that His will be done, and we live or die is really up to Him. George Washington got a nickname that he was a bulletproof. How many of you heard about Washington? The bulletproof George Washington. Several occasions in his life was preserved for the great mission he would have later on, to command the Continental Army and to be the President of the United States. But one of the first times of battle, actually in a battle, was a little place called Jumonville Glen. And Washington had his troops surrounding this party of Frenchmen down in this little glen. And Washington was wearing a uniform that was a little conspicuous. And he stepped out behind a tree, and the Frenchman saw him and actually fired a volley at him. And now, how many of you have ever been, none of you have been shot at, of course. It's not a fun experience. And Washington, well, his reaction was he wrote a letter home a few days later, and he said, he found the sounds of the bullets whistling around his ears charming. Now, how many of you think a bullet flying past would be a charming sound? Kind of make the instance of you, but Washington found that to be somewhat charming. A few weeks later, he was in another battle, and he was in command of 400 troops. And in the course of the day, 100 of the 400 men under Washington's command were shot, killed, and wounded. Washington himself, very conspicuous again, a very large man. Washington about 6'3", very large, powerful man. And even though 25% of his men were killed and wounded, he was not scratched by a bullet. Then a year later, he goes in another battle with General Braddock. And in that battle, Washington again escapes, where every single officer, 56 officers went into the battle. He's the only one that came out without being touched by a bullet. When the battle was over, he takes his coat off. He finds 4 bullet holes. And this is a coat very similar to what I'm wearing here. Imagine 4 bullets going through his coat, but not one of them hit him. And he just said it was the hand of Providence. Years later, he met up with the Indians of that battle, an Indian chief. And that chief told him that I personally shot at you 17 times that day. And I instructed my other braves to shoot at you, but not one of the bullets touched him. And he said he was known as the man with a particular favor in heaven who can never die in battle. Later on in the Revolutionary War, Washington, the Kips Bay, British came across the Manhattan Island, and Washington's men simply threw down their arms and ran in panic as the British were coming. And Washington was on his horse, again, very conspicuous. And as the army just ran past him, Washington was very disgusted. One of the two times that Washington probably lost his temper in the war, he takes his hat off and just throws it on the ground. As his men are running by, he says, "Are these the men which I'm supposed to defend America?" And then Washington got back on his horse. He was very, very, very despondent. He really thought this was maybe the end of his career as a general. His army running past, he was just really concerned about that. And he sat there on his horse, right out in front of where his army is supposed to be. And then a British officer, the best shot in the British Army, named Patrick Ferguson, rode up on, he was actually stalking on foot. He had a really fancy rifle, a breech loader, very new and innovative in the day. And he could shoot a group like this probably at 100 yards with that rifle. And Washington was on his horse about from here to the wall at the back of our stadium, sitting there on his horse. Patrick Ferguson takes his rifle, cocks the hammer, takes aim at George Washington, and just as he's getting ready to squeeze the trigger, he said, "I had this overwhelming feeling not to squeeze the trigger." And he put his rifle down. And then he kind of shook, he goes, "Well, that's silly." And he takes it again, he puts his rifle up, and he's just getting ready to take the shot. Once again, he had this huge, overwhelming feeling, "Do not kill this man." And he did it a third time. And again, that very strong, overwhelming feeling that I believe is the Holy Ghost, telling him, "Do not shoot this man." And Ferguson finally puts his rifle down, he walks away, and a few minutes later, an aide comes by, gets Washington by the reins, horse by the reins, and leads him off the battlefield. And then later on, Ferguson found out that in fact that was George Washington. A little bit later, Washington was another battle where he actually was, Washington loved being in battle. It's kind of a strange thing, but he really loved being in battle. And his troops were advancing on the British at Princeton. And Washington, again on his horse, very, very obvious target. He rides out between his men and the British Army. 40 yards away from the British Army, 800 men in this battalion. And the battalion commander gives an order for his battalion to take aim. Well, British Army didn't take aim. British Army gave, said, present. They just dropped their muskets and fire. But these men dropped their muskets, present, fire, and Washington's aide was standing there, and he said, "I turned my head so the bill of my hat obscured my commander-in-chief, because I just knew he was going to be killed. I did not want to see George Washington killed." So he turns his head like this, and then this thunderous volley rings out, and as the smoke drifts off, there's Washington still on his horse, untouched by a single bullet from that entire battalion fire. And he leads his men on to that victory of the Battle of Princeton. Just an unstoppable man. But what really makes Washington a great man, of course, is his example. There was a time late in the war when the Army was very disgruntled. They hadn't been paid for years. There was an officer that was causing a lot of problem, and he actually organized the officers of the American Army to march on Congress and demand that they receive back pay. Basically, he's going to seize the government. And he did this meeting in secret. Now, Washington got wind of this meeting, and earlier that day he had got a letter from one of the members of Congress telling him, "We're doing the best we can, we're trying to find food, we're trying to find clothing, we're doing the best that we can." And Washington put this letter in his pocket. Then he went to this meeting, unannounced, and he walks in, and it's quite a surprise. Here are all the Army officers in there, General Gates leading this conspiracy. And Washington just walks in, and the place just goes from a buzz and a hum to just dead silence. When Washington walked in the room, he fell. He had a presence that was just inescapable. And as Washington walks in, he goes up to the stand up there, and he addressed the people in there, and he said, "Congress is doing the best they can for us, and trying to convince them to hang on, the war's almost over. Please don't do this. And he said, in fact, I have a letter here from a congressman, and he pulls his letter out and he puts it down here and he's starting to read it, and he's looking at it and he can't read it. And Washington, very, very embarrassed, he reaches in his pocket and he pulled out a pair of glasses. Now, no one had ever seen George Washington in glasses. His eyes were fading, and he kind of looks out there, very embarrassed, very vain man in many ways. And he just looks at these glasses, and he looks at the men, these officers that have followed him all these years. And he said, I have not only grown gray and white in your service, I seem to have grown blind as well. And he puts his glasses on, and he reads this little letter. And the officers in the army that day, when they looked at Washington up there, and realized the personal sacrifice he had made, many of the officers just broke down in tears. The beloved commander, grown blind and gray in the service of his country. If he can do this, can we be the subject? And he marched off. The meetings that broke up, the men left. A little while later, one of the officers, a few months later, asked Washington if he had considered being the new king of America. And Washington, his reaction when he said the word king was like someone slapped him in the face. And he said, nothing I've ever heard in my life hurt me more or affected me more than that. And of course, that was something he would not do. Washington voluntarily stepped down from power. He could have been the dictator of America, but his great character wouldn't allow it. And King George said when he heard Washington did not assume the dictatorship of America, basically, King George said he is the greatest man of the century. And indeed he was. Now another great man, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. What's Lincoln's nickname? Honest Abe. On Lincoln's 100th birthday, Woodrow Wilson, who was in the, I think he was over Princeton University, gave an address speaking of Lincoln on his 100th birthday. And he was talking about Lincoln's honesty, and I just want to share what Woodrow Wilson said about Lincoln. And this is kind of weird. When I first read this to my 5th graders, they took great exception to this speech. Until I kind of had a little bit of time to explain it. Does everyone know, probably in science you might talk about qualities of something? The qualities are something that makes something up, correct? The totality of the qualities makes something. Ice has qualities, like it's solid, it's cold, it has translucent, things like that. So these are individual things that make up the whole. So kind of bear that in mind a little bit with this speech. Woodrow Wilson says, well, we say that Lincoln was honest. Men used to call him Honest Abe. But honesty is not a quality. Honesty is the manifestation of character. Lincoln was honest because there was nothing small or petty about him, and only smallness or pettiness can produce dishonesty. Honesty is a quality of largeness. Little men run to cover and deceive you. Big men cannot and will not run to cover and will not deceive you. Lincoln's honesty was not produced by any deliberate calculation, but was the expression of the great nature behind it. Abraham Lincoln was a man who was extremely honest in all his life. He got a nickname being called Honest Abe. That nickname came from when he was in school as a teenager. He went to school one day, and the schoolmaster, the little log cabin he used to hold school in, the schoolmaster had shot a big deer, and he mounted the horns up on the wall just over the door of the classroom. And Abraham Lincoln, when he was going out for today it'd be like going out for recess or something, the boys kind of dared him to jump up and hang on the horns. Now none of you would do that, I don't know, right? Well, Lincoln jumped up and grabbed hold of one of the antlers, and with his weight, of course, he broke it off. And when the schoolmaster came back in, and he asked who did that, now what would be the normal answer? I don't know, did it, right? When the schoolmaster asked who did it, Abraham Lincoln raised his hand and said, I'm sorry, I did. And his classmates were like, wow, told the truth. So his classmates started calling him Honest Abe. That was just one of the real early examples where he actually got his nickname from. But in life, Lincoln ran a store, and if he thought he'd shortchanged somebody one day, the weights on the balance scale went out of balance, and realized that he had cheated accidentally a customer out of some of the products that she had been buying. And he closed the store and walked 4 miles to give her back 4 pennies that he had overcharged her on the sale. He did things like this constantly. One of the jobs Lincoln had as a young man was he was the postmaster of a place called New Salem, Illinois, where he lived. And as postmaster, it was his duty to collect the postage. Now, in those days, you didn't put a stamp on a letter. You actually, when you got a letter, you had to go pay to get the letter. And Lincoln had acquired a little bit of money, an astounding sum of $17 that he had collected as postmaster. Now, the little town of New Salem kind of went away, and Lincoln didn't have a job there, so Lincoln moved to the new town of Springfield, Illinois. And when he got there, he rode in on a borrowed horse, and everything he owned on earth was in a pair of saddlebags. And he rides into Springfield, and he goes to a country store, and he wanted to know what it would take. Joshua Speed said, well, I have an arrangement here. He said, I have an extra room. You can stay here for a while till you get on your feet. And Lincoln went down, got his saddlebags, caught him up there, put him on the floor of the room, and he looked at Joshua Speed. He said, I am moved. What kind of meaning that two tenses, right? 2 different ways. Literally, he had just moved in with everything he owned by putting the saddlebags down. But emotionally, he was moved with the man's generosity. Now, later on, Lincoln became a very successful warrior here, and years later, a man from the federal government tracked Lincoln down and wanted to know what that money was that he had collected as postmaster. And Lincoln immediately stands up, walks over to a trunk that he has, and gets out a rag with the money wrapped up in it, takes it, hands it to him, and says, here's the $17. I never used another man's money. That story always touched me in a way because you can see that Lincoln's honesty. But he comes into Springfield, it would have been very tempting. He had exactly $17, and what he needed was exactly $17. Now, he could have robbed Peter and paid Paul, you might say. But Lincoln didn't do it. As desperate as he would not use another man's money because that was dishonest. That's one of the things with Abraham Lincoln. Now, in May of 1831, Lincoln floated on a raft down the Ohio River and the Mississippi River to New Orleans to sell the gold coats. And as he got into New Orleans was just this incredible, lively, vibrant town at that time. And when Lincoln comes in, he kind of goes around town to see what's going on. And then he saw something that shocked him. Something that affected him to the very depths of his soul. He was walking down the street and he came upon a slave market. A place where people were bidding and buying human beings. Men, women, and children from Africa. And Lincoln looked at this and it just sorrowed him, it enraged him, it touched him to the depth of his soul. And he turned to his companions and he come down the river with him and he said, let's get away from this. But if I ever have a chance, I'm going to hit this thing hard. And little did anyone know that 30 years later, Lincoln would hit it so hard it was actually a fatal blow, that thing. Now Lincoln becomes president. Lincoln was actually one of the founding members of the Republican Party at the time, and one of the founding reasons for the Republican Party was to end the evils of slavery. Lincoln made a great speech where he said, and I just quote his quote here, he said, let us have faith that right makes might, And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty if we understand it. Lincoln was a very, very firm believer in you ascertain what is right in life, and then you go ahead and do it. Don't let anything stand in your way. You don't tell one person one thing and tell another person another thing to be a politician. When Lincoln was running for president, people would ask him to give a speech or something. He would simply say, "Well, read what I've already said. My opinion is not going to change because I'm running for president." The extension of slavery into territories and into all parts of the country is what so enraged Lincoln got into politics on the national level. He ran for president, and when he was elected, the South left the Union. The country was torn apart, split in half, North against the South. Now, Lincoln's job as president was primarily to preserve the Union. Now, Lincoln personally very opposed to slavery. He wanted to do everything he could to get rid of it. But as president, he was limited in his power, what he could do. Because the Constitution limited what a president had the ability to do and not do as it does today. But during the war, Lincoln found that there may be one way that he could possibly free the slaves. And that was as commander-in-chief of the army. The slaves in the South were being used to further the military goals of the South. They were using them as a labor force. And Lincoln thought, as commander-in-chief, I may have the power to deny them that asset. Lincoln at one point said, I will free some of the slaves, I will free none of the slaves, or I'll free all of them if it will preserve the Union. Because Lincoln recognized that if the United States is torn apart and is no longer a country, he will not have the power to free anyone or do the good things that he knew must be done. He needed to preserve the Union first, and then go after the great evil. But in the course of the war, he found that as commander-in-chief, he might be able to achieve this aim of preserving the Union and freeing the slaves. So he issued something called the Emancipation Proclamation. How many have heard of the Emancipation Proclamation? Emancipation giving freedom, of course, to the slaves. And he allowed the South to have the option, if they wanted to a certain date. If you do not come back into the Union, then you will lose your slaves, hoping to preserve the Union. And when he signed it, he said this particular day, he came into the cabinet meeting and he read a really funny story from one of the top comedians of the day, Artemus Ward. And nobody in the cabinet was in a laughing mood that day. And Lincoln read this, to him, a hilarious story, and nobody laughed. And Lincoln just kind of puts the story down. He said, he said, if I can't laugh once in a while, I will simply die. But they brought in the Emancipation Proclamation after that and set it down. And Lincoln had been shaking hands at a public reception that day, about 11 o'clock in the morning until this was now late in the afternoon. And his hand was just like crushed. Now, Lincoln never wore gloves. You're supposed to, as a gentleman back in the day, you were always supposed to have gloves on when you're shaking hands. You never actually touched anybody. Lincoln wanted to touch people, and he never had his gloves on. But his hand was crushed that day from all the people shaking his hand. As he sat down, he said, this is the story Frederick Seward says, that the broadsheet was spread before him on the cabinet table. Mr. Lincoln dipped his pen in the ink and then, holding it a moment above the paper, seemed to hesitate. Looking around, he said, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. But I've been shaking hands since 11 o'clock this morning, till my arm is stiff and numb. Now, the signature is one that will be closely examined in the future, and if they find that my hand trembled, they will say he had some compunction. But anyway, it's going to be done. So saying, he slowly and carefully wrote at the bottom of the proclamation, Abraham Lincoln. The thing was done, a simple act, the one which ultimately struck the shackles from 4 million human beings and fulfilled and realized the dream of the men of George Washington, the founding fathers, the people that had a dream that all men are created equal, as written in the Declaration. This dream of Abraham Lincoln was finally realized with the Emancipation Proclamation. But even more importantly, Lincoln pushed through what they called the 13th Amendment, that made the first and only mention really of slavery in the Constitution is its complete annihilation. With the 13th Amendment, he pushed through the last few months of his presidency before his life was taken. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln, through his legacy, we know what a great, incredible man he was, freeing the slaves, fulfilling that dream of the Constitution of all men are created equal. Now, it took a long time before that was fully realized, but with Washington and with Lincoln in particular, we have a nation that's founded on the right principles for the right reasons. That what the nation could become was more important than what the men even felt at the time in their own lives. Well, I'm just really proud to call these men friends, and I come to call them friends because I come to know them through books and reading and studying their words. The same way that the words you leave behind, people know who you are. So I just read what you can and write what you will, but write what you think and feel, so others coming years from now know what you really are as a person. That we did enough to come to know Washington country. Okay, we need to get probably back to class here, so thank you and have a good President's Day.